What initially seemed like a tragic accident soon unraveled into a chilling story of deception, desperation, and murder. Hannah Guilford, an 18-year-old high school senior in Cuckoo, Indiana, was adored by many. As the star cheerleader of Cuckoo Community High School, she dazzled crowds with her halftime performances and was frequently featured in local newspapers. But behind the bright lights and polished routines, Hannah carried a secret that would ultimately seal her fate. She lived with her parents, Randy Guilford, 38, and Katrina Guilford, 34, in a quiet suburban home. Randy, a failed athlete turned sales manager, projected his lost dreams onto his daughter, pushing her toward perfection in both sports and academics. Meanwhile, Katrina, once an involved and loving mother, had faded into the background, numbing herself with alcohol to escape the weight of her own disappointments. Their home, though seemingly normal from the outside, was filled with resentment, tension, and unspoken words. What no one knew was that Hannah was entangled in a forbidden relationship with her cheerleading coach, Masterson, a man nearly twice her age. The relationship, already a dangerous secret, became even more complicated when Hannah discovered she was pregnant. She told no one, not her parents, not her friends. She knew the scandal would destroy everything. But as the weeks passed, the weight of her situation grew unbearable. Her friends noticed her withdrawal. The once radiant girl became distant, her bright smile forced, her energy depleted. At home, the fights between her parents escalated, Randy's relentless demands clashing with Katrina's increasing detachment. Hannah, caught between their dysfunction and her own growing fear, was running out of time. On the morning of May 12, 2016 at 7:30 a.m., Randy descended into the basement, expecting to find his daughter getting ready for school. Instead, he found her lifeless body crumpled at the foot of the stairs, her head twisted unnaturally, blood pooling beneath her. Cheerleading equipment and trophies, symbols of everything he had pushed her toward, were scattered around her like relics of a life cut short. For a brief moment, he stood frozen. Then, a chilling realization settled over him. This was no accident. Disbelief gave way to panic. For a moment, Randy stood frozen, his mind refusing to process the sight of his daughter's lifeless body sprawled at the foot of the stairs. Then instinct took over. He rushed to her, his hands trembling as he reached out, searching for any sign of life. But Hannah was gone. The girl who had once been the center of his world, who had filled their home with energy and ambition, now lay motionless at his feet, her body unnaturally twisted, her skin already cold. His breath came in ragged gasps as he fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. "My daughter, she's not breathing," he stammered, his voice raw with shock. The operator pressed for details, but Randy could barely form words. The only thought pounding in his head was the brutal finality of it all. Hannah would never go to college, never chase the dreams she had fought so hard for. Minutes later, flashing lights cut through the morning haze as paramedics rushed inside. It took them mere seconds to confirm what Randy already knew. Hannah was dead. The basement, once filled with laughter and the echoes of her relentless drive, had been reduced to an eerie, suffocating silence. Upstairs, Katrina Guilford was still in bed, her body heavy with the remnants of last night's drinking. The muffled voices, the sirens, the static in the air barely registered, until she heard her husband's anguished sobs. She sat up slowly, disoriented, the taste of vodka thick on her tongue. Then reality crashed down like a sledgehammer. The scream that tore from her throat was not the cry of a grieving mother, but something raw, primal, a sound of absolute devastation. It filled every corner of the house, swallowing the police radio chatter and the hushed murmurs of the paramedics. By 8:00 a.m., Cuckoo police had arrived, the quiet suburban street now lined with squad cars. Detective Brielle Reno, a seasoned officer with an unflinching gaze, took in the scene with cold calculation. The sudden death of a well-loved high school cheerleader would shake the town to its core. But something about this case felt wrong from the start. Descending into the dimly lit basement, Reno's eyes swept over the scene. Hannah's body, the carefully arranged trophies and ribbons, the blood, or lack thereof. The injuries suggested a fall, but the positioning of her limbs told a different story. Something had happened here, something violent. Forensics moved quickly, marking every detail, photographing every angle. A large trophy near Hannah's body caught Reno's attention. A smear on its surface, almost invisible in the low light, set off alarm bells. It was heavy enough to be a weapon, lethal enough. It was bagged, tagged, and sent for analysis. The house itself felt suffocating. In the living room, the television droned on, its cheerful morning hosts oblivious to the tragedy unfolding just feet away. On the coffee table, a half-empty bottle of vodka stood as a testament to Katrina's demons. She sat slumped on the couch, her face drawn and hollow, her hands gripping at nothing. Randy paced the room, his movements erratic, his grief tangled with something else, something unreadable. He answered questions, gave statements, but his voice was detached, as if speaking from another place entirely. Reno watched him carefully. Somewhere in this house, the truth was buried, and she intended to dig it up. That same day, the preliminary forensic report revealed a disturbing truth. Hannah wasn't just pregnant, she was also HIV positive. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation, turning an already tragic case into something far more sinister. Investigators shifted their focus to Hannah's relationships, particularly her secret, forbidden affair with her married cheerleading coach, Eric Masterson, a man whose influence extended far beyond the school's athletic department. From the moment Detective Brielle Reno laid eyes on the crime scene, she knew Hannah's death was no accident. The pregnancy, the medical diagnosis, the unsettling details at the scene, it all pointed to a truth someone was desperate to bury. Her first target was Eric Masterson. At 46, Masterson was a respected figure in the community. His ability to command a room, to push on his athletes to their limits, had made him an almost untouchable presence at Cook Community High School. But Reno had seen it before. Powerful men with secrets they would do anything to keep hidden. Inside a dimly lit interrogation room, Masterson sat rigid in his chair. Sweat formed along his hairline, his fingers drumming against the metal table in an unconscious rhythm. The hum of the air conditioner was the only sound filling the tense silence. At first, he played the role of the grieving mentor. He spoke of Hannah's talent, her drive, her ability to command attention on the mat. She was special, he murmured, his voice thick with forced emotion. She had a future brighter than any of them. But Reno wasn't interested in rehearsed sentimentality. Her questions sharpened. She pressed him on his relationship with Hannah, on the rumors, on the whispers that had followed them for months. Masterson's demeanor shifted. His body stiffened, his jaw clenched. I had nothing but professional respect for her, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence he was trying to project. Then Reno slid a folder across the table. Inside were explicit text messages and photos exchanged between him and Hannah, conversations that left no room for misinterpretation. Evidence that tied him to her in a way he could no longer deny. Masterson's face drained of color. His hands clenched into fists against the table. She made me feel like a dog in heat, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. But I never wanted it to go this far. Reno didn't flinch. She let his words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. We know Hannah was pregnant, Coach, she said, her tone cold, measured. The autopsy confirmed it, and the timeline makes you the father. Masterson's breathing turned shallow, his fingers twitching as if resisting the urge to reach for something, anything to steady himself. Before he could speak, Reno leaned forward, her next words slicing through whatever remained of his composure. She also tested positive for HIV. The silence that followed was suffocating. Masterson's mouth opened, then closed. His fingers curled against the table as though he could crush the truth in his grip. I didn't know, he whispered finally, his voice cracking. I swear to God, I didn't know I was positive. Reno studied him, her expression unreadable. Did she know? He shook his head violently. No, she didn't know. His breath hitched. I never wanted to hurt her. But the damage was done, and Reno wasn't convinced. Masterson continued to deny any involvement in Hannah's death. He insisted he had no idea what she planned that morning, no knowledge of the growing weight pressing down on her. But as the interrogation dragged on, his agitation only grew. His hands trembled, his voice cracked, Every denial felt more like an attempt to convince himself rather than anyone else. By the end of the interview, Masteron was released, but not before Reno made her message clear. "You're at the center of this now, coach," she said, her eyes locked onto his. "And I don't stop until I find the truth." Her next stop was Randy Guilford, Hannah's father, and Reno had a feeling he had his own secrets to tell. Randy Guilford was more than just a grieving father. He was a man whose ambitions had long bled into his daughter's life, twisting love into something suffocating. A sales manager at a local car dealership, he was well known in Cuco, not just for his charisma, but for his relentless drive. A former high school athlete, his own sports career had been stolen from him by a back injury, leaving behind a void he forced Hannah to fill. She wasn't just his daughter, she was his second chance. Every routine, every competition, every victory belonged to both of them. From the start, something about Randy's grief felt wrong. His concern fixated less on his daughter's violent end and more on the stain it might leave on their family's reputation. He grilled investigators about what the press might uncover, how the school would handle the fallout. When he spoke of Hannah, it wasn't as a lost child but as a ruined legacy. During his interview, Randy clung to the image of a doting, supportive father. "She was the best," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Hannah was going places, and I made sure she had every opportunity." But text messages, pulled from his phone, told another story, one that sickened even the most seasoned detectives. Randy had known about Hannah's relationship with Coach Masteron. More than that, he had facilitated it. In one message, he suggested times for them to meet, covering for her with excuses at home. Another message, sent after a regional cheerleading competition, congratulated Masteron, not on the team's performance, but on Hannah's. The implication was unmistakable. When confronted with the evidence, Randy denied everything. His face reddened, his voice rising. "I don't remember sending that," he muttered, gripping the edge of the table. But as the silence stretched, the fight drained from him. "I thought it was harmless," he finally admitted. "She was happy, and he cared about her success as much as I did." Reno's expression didn't change. "And when you found out she was pregnant?" she asked. "When you found out she was HIV positive?" Randy's entire body tensed, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. "I didn't know," he hissed. "If I had, I would have stopped it." But Reno wasn't convinced. Everything about Randy, from his obsession with control to his cold, calculated responses, told her there was more to uncover. His actions, his influence over Hannah's life, the disturbing texts, it all pointed to a man who had long seen his daughter as a possession rather than a person. By the end of the interview, Reno was certain of one thing: Randy Guilford was lying. And if he had been willing to turn a blind eye to the abuse, what else had he been capable of? The next person under Reno's scrutiny was Katrina Guilford, Hannah's mother. At 34, Katrina was a woman swallowed by disappointment. She had once been the golden girl of Cuco, a former cheerleader, a small-town beauty queen with an infectious laugh. But in May 2016, she was a ghost of that person, hollowed out by alcoholism and years of feeling like a bystander in her own home. Randy's obsession with Hannah's cheerleading career had turned their marriage into a performance, one where Katrina was little more than background noise. The more Randy pushed Hannah, the more Katrina withdrew. Her presence at practices became infrequent. Her voice, once a source of warmth and encouragement, slurred into drunken mutterings. Her drinking was an open secret. Neighbors saw her stumbling out of the local liquor store, clutching cheap bottles of vodka like lifelines. Sobriety became the rare occasion, not the norm. Friends drifted away. The warmth she had once brought to her family was replaced by resentment, bitterness, and the sting of alcohol in her breath. And Hannah felt it. Their relationship had deteriorated into something fragile and resentful. Katrina saw the pressure Randy placed on their daughter and hated it. But she did nothing to stop it. Instead, she drank. Instead, she let the weight of it all smother her until she barely recognized the girl who used to run into her arms. Now her daughter was gone. And Reno had a feeling Katrina knew more than she was letting on. During her interview with Detective Reno, Katrina unraveled further. Her emotions swung violently between raw, guttural sobbing and eerie detachment. When asked about her relationship with Hannah, her responses were erratic. Shifting from declarations of unwavering love, "Hannah was my baby," she repeated again and again, to stammering, fragmented recollections that led nowhere. But when the subject of Coach Masteron arose, the atmosphere in the room changed. Katrina's entire body went rigid. Her hands curled into fists. Her breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. Then, without warning, her grief twisted into fury. "Hannah was always the perfect little girl," she spat, her voice dripping with venom, "but she had no right to take what was mine." The words hung in the air like poison. Reno didn't respond right away. She simply watched as Katrina's face contorted with something raw and ugly. "That man was supposed to love me," Katrina continued, voice cracking. The resentment in her voice bordered on obsession. The betrayal she felt, genuine or imagined, ran deep. When Reno carefully broached the idea that Hannah's death might not have been an accident, Katrina snapped. She lurched forward, screaming, her words dissolving into a blur of denial and rage. The outburst was wild, unrestrained, before it broke into a shuddering collapse of tears. Reno had seen grief before. This was something else. This was a woman crumbling under the weight of something much heavier than loss. 1 week after Hannah's death, on May 18, 2016, the town gathered in the high school gymnasium for her memorial. The air was thick with sorrow. Teachers, classmates, family members, hundreds of mourners sat in silence, listening to tearful tributes. The grief was heavy, palpable. Then Randy Guilford stood up. At first, it was unclear what he was doing. He swayed slightly, gripping the pew in front of him for balance. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. The moment he opened his mouth, the tension in the room shifted. His voice was thick with alcohol, his words slurred but unmistakable. He confessed. He confessed that he knew, that he had always known, that Katrina had killed their daughter. A stunned silence swallowed the gymnasium. His words came in a rush, desperate and unfiltered. He spoke of panic, of fear, of the need to protect the family, to bury what had happened before it ruined them all. He had helped her. He had helped stage the scene, erase the truth, twist the story into something more acceptable, more palatable. The room turned cold. Detective Reno, who had attended the service to observe the family, rose quietly from her seat. The moment she caught the eye of her colleagues, officers from the Cuco Police Department moved in. Randy was escorted out of the gym as stunned whispers erupted behind him. The confession changed everything. Investigators returned to the Guilford home, this time with sharpened eyes. And what they found only confirmed their worst suspicions. The basement had been cleaned, but not well enough. Traces of blood, faint but present, remained. Further examination revealed additional fragments of a broken trophy overlooked in the initial search. Forensic analysis confirmed what they already knew. The blood was Hannah's, and with Randy's confession, the story of what had happened in that basement began to take shape. A story of rage, betrayal, and the final moments of a girl who had been caught in the violent unraveling of the people who were supposed to protect her. Investigators determined that the truth was far uglier than anyone had imagined. The argument between Katrina and Hannah had been brief, but brutal. Fueled by alcohol and resentment, Katrina had grabbed one of Hannah's trophies and swung. Once, maybe twice. The impact was immediate, the damage irreversible. And when she realized what she had done, she stood there staring at the crumpled body of her daughter, her breath ragged, her fingers still wrapped around the blood-slicked trophy. She didn't call for help. She called Randy. When he arrived, he didn't ask questions. He saw Hannah's body, saw the panic in Katrina's eyes, and made his choice. Together, they set the stage. They dragged Hannah's lifeless form to the base of the stairs, arranging her limbs just so. They scattered her cheerleading gear to complete the illusion. A tragic accident. That was the story they would tell. And for a while, they almost believed it. But lies don't hold forever. On May 20th, 2016, just 38 hours after Randy's drunken confession, authorities named Katrina Guilford as the prime suspect in her daughter's murder. The announcement sent shockwaves through Cuco. People whispered in hushed tones, struggling to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the horror of what she had done. Katrina, once just another suburban mother with a drinking problem, was now something else entirely. Detective Brielle Reno led the arrest in the early hours of the morning. The sky was overcast, the air heavy, as if the world itself had grown weary of the Guilfords' secrets. When Katrina answered the door, she looked hollowed out, her features drawn, her skin pale and worn. She didn't fight, she didn't scream. She simply held out her wrists as the cuffs clicked shut, and then finally she crumbled. Tears streamed down her face, not in protest but in surrender. She had spent days waiting for this moment. As officers led her away, the street remained eerily silent. The suburban neighborhood that once bustled with life now felt abandoned, its windows dark, its houses watching. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic, indifferent to the tragedy unfolding. At the station, Katrina was charged with her daughter's murder. In the interrogation room, she sat motionless for a long time, staring at the table in front of her. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, unsteady, but she didn't hold back. She told them everything. It had started with an argument, she said, the kind that had happened before but had never gone this far. She had been drunk again. Hannah had been distant again. But this time, Katrina couldn't ignore what was happening between her daughter and Coach Masterson. She could see it in the way he looked at Hannah, in the way Hannah spoke about him, and it should have been her. That attention, that desire, it should have belonged to her. Something inside her snapped. She remembered the way Hannah flinched when she raised the trophy. She remembered the sickening sound when it connected, and then nothing. Silence. And that was the moment she knew she had lost everything. She called Randy, and from there, it was survival. Fear took over. It wasn't about Hannah anymore. It was about them, about keeping their lives intact, about protecting what was left. And so they turned their daughter's death into an accident, hoping the world would believe the lie. Randy had cracked first, and now it was her turn. The arrest shattered at whatever illusions remained about the Guilford family. The picture-perfect facade was gone, stripped away to reveal something much darker underneath. The town of Cuco, once quick to admire the family's success, now spoke of them in hushed, horrified whispers. The truth had finally come out, and there was nothing left to protect them from it. The trial of Katrina Guilford for the murder of her daughter began in late August 2018 at the Jackson County Courthouse in Cuco, Indiana. From the moment it was announced, it became a spectacle. The media swarmed the courthouse, turning the tragedy into headlines, dissecting every moment of the case. The courtroom was packed. Neighbors, former friends, people who had once admired the Guilford family, but now sought something else. The truth, or at least a version of it that would let them sleep at night. At the prosecution table, District Attorney Mark Luna wasted no time painting Katrina as a woman rotted by jealousy, bitterness festering beneath the surface for years. He described how her resentment toward Hannah's relationship with Coach Masterson had reached a boiling point, how she had swung that trophy with violent intent, and how, in the aftermath, she had dragged her husband into her web of deception. The forensic evidence was damning. Randy's confession was the final nail in her coffin. There was no mystery, no room for doubt. Katrina had killed her daughter. And then, she had tried to make the world believe it was an accident. On the other side of the room, the defense fought to claw back some semblance of humanity for Katrina. Public defender Leah Boone Ranch didn't argue innocence. She couldn't. The blood had dried on Katrina's hands long before the trial began. Instead, she painted a portrait of a woman spiraling, drowning in years of emotional ruin, addiction, and mental instability. She asked the jury to see Katrina not as a murderer, but as a mother consumed by self-loathing, whose rage had flared in a single, irreversible moment. She begged them to consider leniency, not mercy, just the recognition that Katrina had already been living in her own kind of hell long before the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The trial stretched on, an exhausting, brutal dissection of a family that had rotted from the inside out. Hannah's classmates sat in the gallery, their faces pale, their expressions frozen somewhere between grief and disbelief. Some of them had spent years at sleepovers in the Guilford home, once welcomed with warm smiles and platters of snacks. Now they listened as those same walls were stripped bare, revealing something far uglier than they had ever imagined. When the jury disappeared behind closed doors, the world outside the courtroom held its breath. 2 days passed, and then finally the verdict came. Guilty, second-degree murder. Katrina Guilford was sentenced to 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole. The words hung heavy in the air, but they didn't bring peace. For some, justice had been served. Katrina would pay for what she had done. For others, it wasn't so simple. They saw a woman who had crumbled under the weight of her own demons, whose punishment was merely an extension of the suffering she had already endured. The debates would linger for years. Was it justice or just another tragedy layered onto an already unbearable one? For Randy Guilford, the trial marked the final, devastating collapse of the life he had tried so desperately to control. His complicity in the cover-up had sealed his fate in the court of public opinion. Whatever future he had once envisioned was gone, replaced by a long, lonely road of guilt, shame, and isolation. The town of Cocoa changed that year. Hannah Guilford's name became a whispered cautionary tale, a grim reminder of how envy, rage, and broken love could turn a family into something unrecognizable. The cheerleading squad at her school retired her uniform number. The gym where her memorial had been held forever tainted by the memory of Randy's confession. Parents held their children closer. Neighbors no longer trusted the smiles behind closed doors. And somewhere in a prison cell far from the town she once called home, Katrina Guilford sat alone, staring at the walls, waiting for the years to pass.